Hello, my name's Alora, and in this video we're going to be doing something slightly different than the tutorial kind of things that I usually do, because in this video I'm just going to be putting on the finishing touches to all of those Victorian undergarments that I've been making in the last month and a half. Now that I pretty much have the undergarments required to give me the correct silhouette, I just wanted to detail them slightly because I haven't done full justice to them, to what I wanted to do to them. So that's what we're doing here. I should probably tell you what exactly I'm going to be doing today, and there will be little timestamps on the bar below if there's something specific you wanted to check out. But I'm going to be detailing my corset, which includes adding a hook to it in the front, as well as flossing it and going in and putting in a little bit of extra support at the top points of those gores on the corset. And then I am also going to be adding in an eyelet onto the petticoat and doing some detail embroidery work on my chemise. So I think that is pretty much it. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the process of today, make myself some tea, of course, to get started. I will probably talk to you again in editing and give you guys a few photo references of what and why I am doing what I am doing. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. Of course, if I am looking at a long day of sewing, I must start with tea. And while I wait for that to steep, I'm gonna get all of my materials ready. I'm just using some basic synthetic white embroidery floss that I have on hand. And some large gauge jewelry wire to make my hook out of. This means I will also need some wire cutters and some jewelry pliers. My first task today is going to be the flossing. It generally seems like a lot of Victorian corsets have some sort of cross design for the flossing, such as this one. So I'm using that as my base and then just kind of adding my own flair to it. I'm also changing up the design slightly for the flossing depending on if the boning channel has 1, 2, or 3 bones in it. I'll show you close-ups of how I do each of those 3 in case you're interested. And then I am not using a full piece of embroidery floss. I am breaking it into 2 separate pieces, each with 3 strands in it. I use the same 3 strands later when I am reinforcing the gores as well. And I find those jewelry pliers are actually quite helpful at this point, just because that coutil can be a little troublesome to pull a needle through from time to time. Of course, a thimble certainly helps with that as well. Assuming the kittens will let me, I am now moving on to those gores. I'm using just a very simple whip stitch here, going around the edge of the turned back fabric at the gores, covering up that edge down about 1/4 of an inch from the top point of the gore. I've seen some fancier examples of how to reinforce this point on a corset, but I figured this was sufficient. Once I finish this up, it is time to attach the hook, which I first make by cutting a piece of wire and folding it in half, and then bending the half point down over itself, and then curling up the bottom ends, making a hook like this. I'm using what I believe is called a buttonhole stitch to attach those little loops at the bottom of the hook to the corset, and then just using kind of a whip stitch again around the top of the hook to secure it in place. Now, I am aware that the color of this jewelry wire does not really match the other metals of this corset, but I'm not too concerned. If you look at some extant examples, it does not seem uncommon for the hook to be made out of a different metal than the rest of the details on the corset. Once I am done attaching the hook, as that is the final thing to be done to the corset, I go ahead and put it on so that I can mark the petticoat for where the eyelet needs to be. And I do this simply by putting the petticoat on as I usually would, and then simply putting a pin in where that bend in the top of the hook is. Now I'm taking out that pin and using an awl to widen a hole right there in the petticoat, mainly because I don't want to damage the integrity of the fabric by putting any holes in it. And then I'm just using that buttonhole stitch to go around the edge of the eyelet. Now, the petticoat that was my inspiration for this one actually has an eyelet in it. You'll see that in the first image here. But this was not super uncommon. I found a number of other petticoats that all had this eyelet at the top. One thing to note is that all of these petticoats seemed to be silk petticoats. I couldn't find any cotton examples that had eyelets in them. I imagine this is because that eyelet is really there for people who are super concerned about keeping their petticoat down to create as little bulk around the waist as possible, which leads me to believe that these petticoats were used for more formal occasions, where one would like to look as stylish as possible. So perhaps not necessary for my cotton petticoat, but you know what? I'm gonna do it anyways. Now, while I am going through and putting in these stitches around the eyelet, I find that the hole occasionally gets misshaped, so I just periodically use that awl again to reform my hole, just to make that eyelet a little easier to put in. And for the final task, I am embroidering my chemise. In the original inspiration for this chemise, they have a little monogram just below the center of the neckline lace, and I thought this was a super cute personalization detail. So I just went to Pinterest and kind of searched old-timey fonts and found this capital A design that I liked and traced that onto my petticoat with a pencil. And then I just pulled the fabric taut inside of an embroidery hoop. Now, I am no expert at embroidery. I can count the number of times I have done embroidery on a single hand. So I'm not going to show you too much of this because definitely not the person to emulate here. I'm doing all of my straight lines with a running stitch that I just do to the end of the line and then come back to fill in the gaps. And then I'm using, I believe it's called a couching stitch? to fill in the thicker portions. Yeah, I just looked it up. Definitely not a couching stitch, satin stitch. Definitely a satin stitch. And it's done. And you know, I'm quite happy with how it turned out considering my lack of embroidery experience. And then who could be expected to put in all of that effort detailing all of these garments and not give them all a test drive? So it's time to get dressed and go enjoy them a little bit. I will say that I definitely messed around with the eyelet on the petticoat a little bit, figuring out how to get it on the hook before deciding to just gather the whole skirt up in my hands and do it that way. Much easier. And that's it for this video. I hope that you all enjoyed seeing how I put the finishing touches on my late Victorian undergarments, and I hope to see you all again next week. I come out with a video every Thursday, and now that I'm basically done with the undergarments, it is time to start moving on to the outerwear. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and maybe consider hitting that like or even subscribe button if you feel like it.